The morning sun cast long shadows through the dusty windows of the Silverdale County Courthouse as 12-year-old Daniel Murphy pressed his face against the glass, watching the steady stream of townsfolk filing through the heavy oak doors. Today was the day that would determine whether Marcus Cole, the man who had shown him more kindness than anyone else in his short, difficult life, would hang for a murder Daniel knew he didn't commit. Daniel's stomach churned with hunger and anxiety as he clutched the only possession he truly valued, a worn leather journal that Marcus had given him 6 months earlier. "Every man needs to write down his thoughts, Danny boy," Marcus had said, with that gentle smile that had made Daniel feel like he mattered for the first time in his young life. Especially the thoughts that others might not want to hear. The orphan boy had been living on the streets of Silverdale for 3 years, ever since consumption had claimed both his parents within a week of each other. The townspeople had made half-hearted attempts to place him with families, but Daniel's fierce independence and tendency to speak uncomfortable truths had made him an unwelcome addition to most households. He survived by doing odd jobs, sleeping in barns, and accepting the occasional act of kindness from strangers. Marcus Cole had been different from the start. The quiet blacksmith had discovered Daniel sleeping in his shop one freezing winter night, and instead of throwing him out, had offered him a warm meal and a place to sleep. Over the following months, Marcus had become the closest thing to a father that Daniel had ever known, teaching him to read and write, sharing stories of his own difficult childhood, and treating the orphan boy with a respect that most adults wouldn't show their own children. Now Marcus sat in a jail cell, accused of murdering wealthy rancher Theodore Blackwood during a heated dispute over land rights. The prosecution claimed that Marcus had shot Blackwood in cold blood after losing his temper during a public confrontation about water rights to Silverdale Creek. Daniel knew the truth was far more complicated. But who would believe the word of a homeless orphan against the testimony of respected citizens? The courthouse was packed with spectators eager to see justice served for one of the territory's most prominent landowners. Judge Harrison Fitzgerald presided over the proceedings with the stern authority that had made him both feared and respected throughout the county. The judge was known for his fairness, but also for his unwavering belief in the letter of the law. Prosecutor Benjamin Wade had built what appeared to be an airtight case against Marcus Cole. 3 witnesses claimed to have seen Marcus arguing violently with Blackwood on the day of the murder. The blacksmith's own rifle had been found near the body, and several people testified that Marcus had made threats against Blackwood. In the weeks leading up to the shooting, Daniel squeezed through the crowd and found a spot near the back of the courtroom where he could observe the proceedings. Without drawing attention to himself, his heart sank as he watched Marcus sitting at the defendant's table, looking defeated and resigned to his fate. The court-appointed lawyer, a young man named James Patterson, seemed overwhelmed by the weight of evidence against his client. "The prosecution will prove beyond reasonable doubt," Wade declared in his opening statement, "that Marcus Cole murdered Theodore Blackwood in a fit of rage over a business dispute. The defendant had motive, means, and opportunity. The evidence speaks for itself." Daniel's hands clenched into fists as he listened to witness after witness testify against Marcus. Sarah Jenkins, who owned the boarding house, claimed that Marcus had threatened to settle things permanently with Blackwood. Store owner William Hayes testified that he had seen Marcus practicing with his rifle in the days before the murder, muttering angrily about rich men who think they own everything. The most damaging testimony came from Deputy Sheriff Robert Matthews, who had been the first law enforcement officer on the scene. "I found the defendant's rifle about 50 yards from the body," Matthews testified. "Fresh powder burns on the barrel, 1 cartridge fired recently. Clear as day that this was the murder weapon." Daniel knew that every word of testimony was either a lie or a deliberate misrepresentation of the truth. But he also knew that his own account would be dismissed as the desperate invention of a loyal friend. The journal in his hands contained the real story, written in his own careful handwriting. But who would believe a 12-year-old orphan over respected members of the community? As the prosecution's case unfolded, Daniel noticed something that made his blood run cold. Several of the witnesses kept glancing toward a man sitting in the front row of the gallery, Vernon Blackwood, Theodore's younger brother and heir to the Blackwood Ranch. There was something in those glances, a subtle communication that suggested coordination and planning. Daniel had seen Vernon Blackwood many times during his wanderings around Silverdale, and he had observed things that apparently no one else had noticed or cared to remember. The journal in his hands contained detailed observations about Vernon's gambling debts, his frequent arguments with his brother, and most importantly, his presence in the alley behind the general store on the night of the murder. The defense's case was weak and desperately presented. Marcus himself took the stand and denied the charges, but his testimony seemed hollow against the weight of evidence arrayed against him. He admitted to arguing with Theodore Blackwood about water rights, confirmed that he owned the rifle found at the scene, and acknowledged that he had been angry about the rancher's attempts to monopolize access to Silverdale Creek. "I never threatened Theodore Blackwood's life," Marcus insisted, his voice steady despite the hopelessness of his situation. "We had our differences, but I'm not a killer. I was home reading when the shooting happened, same as I do most evenings." Prosecutor Wade's cross-examination was brutal and methodical. "You had no witnesses to support your claim of being home that evening, did you, Mr. Cole?" "No, sir. I live alone. And you were angry enough about the water rights dispute to make public threats against the victim, weren't you?" "I may have spoken harshly, but I never threatened to kill anyone. Yet your rifle was found at the murder scene with recent powder burns. Someone else must have used it." "My rifle was stolen from my shop 3 days before the murder. How convenient." "Did you report this alleged theft to the sheriff?" "No, sir. I didn't think much of it at the time." Daniel watched the jury's faces as Marcus testified, seeing doubt and disbelief replacing any sympathy they might have felt for the defendant. The prosecution had done its job well, creating a narrative that seemed to account for every piece of evidence while portraying Marcus as a violent man who had simply lost control of his temper. As the trial moved toward its conclusion, Daniel realized that no one was going to save Marcus Cole except him. The journal in his hands contained the truth, but speaking up would require more courage than he had ever needed before. It would mean standing up in front of the entire town, contradicting the testimony of respected citizens, and risking the wrath of powerful people who clearly wanted Marcus convicted. The thought of losing the only person who had ever truly cared about him filled Daniel with desperate determination. Marcus had risked his own reputation and safety to help a homeless orphan, and now it was time for Daniel to return that favor. Regardless of the consequences, Judge Fitzgerald was preparing to charge the jury when Daniel stood up in the back of the courtroom, his young voice cutting through the murmur of conversation like a knife through butter. "Your Honor," Daniel called out, his voice surprisingly strong despite his trembling hands, "I have something to say about this case, something that everyone needs to hear." The courthouse fell into stunned silence as every head turned to stare at the small figure standing in the back row. Judge Fitzgerald's weathered face showed surprise and annoyance at the interruption, while Prosecutor Wade looked as if he had been personally insulted by the orphan boy's audacity. "Young man," Judge Fitzgerald said sternly, "this is a court of law, not a public forum. You cannot simply interrupt legal proceedings whenever you feel like speaking." Daniel's legs felt like water beneath him, but he forced himself to remain standing. "Please, Your Honor. I was there the night Mr. Blackwood was killed. I saw what really happened." A murmur of surprise rippled through the packed courtroom. Marcus Cole looked up with shock and concern, clearly worried about what Daniel might be planning to do. The boy had never mentioned being a witness to the crime, and Marcus feared that his young friend was about to sacrifice himself in a misguided attempt to help. Judge Fitzgerald studied Daniel's face carefully. noting the boy's obvious fear and the way his hands shook as he clutched what appeared to be a leather journal. "Are you saying that you witnessed the murder of Theodore Blackwood?" "Yes, sir," Daniel replied, his voice growing stronger as he found his courage. "And I wrote down everything I saw in this journal, just like Mr. Cole taught me to do." Prosecutor Wade jumped to his feet, his face flushed with anger. "Your Honor, this is clearly a desperate attempt by the defense to introduce fabricated testimony. This boy is known to be closely associated with the defendant and would obviously say anything to save his friend's life." "I object to that characterization," Defense Attorney Patterson interjected, seeing an opportunity to salvage his case. "The witness has a right to be heard, regardless of his age or relationship to my client." Judge Fitzgerald considered the situation carefully. In his 20 years on the bench, he had seen many desperate attempts to overturn seemingly certain convictions, but there was something about the boy's demeanor that suggested genuine truth rather than manufactured deception. "Young man, what is your name?" the judge asked. "Daniel Murphy, Your Honor. I'm 12 years old, and I've been living on the streets of Silverdale since my parents died 3 years ago. And you claim to have witnessed the murder of Theodore Blackwood?" "Yes, sir. I was sleeping in the alley behind Peterson's store when I heard voices arguing. I looked out and saw Mr. Vernon Blackwood talking with his brother Theodore near the old oak tree by Silverdale Creek." At the mention of Vernon Blackwood's name, a shocked gasp went up from the gallery. Vernon himself went pale as a sheet and half rose from his seat before apparently thinking better of drawing attention to himself. Judge Fitzgerald raised his hand for quiet. "Mr. Murphy, these are very serious accusations. You understand that bearing false witness in a capital case is itself a crime?" "Yes, sir. But I'm not lying. I wrote down everything I saw and heard that night, and I can read it to you word for word." The judge looked toward the prosecution and defense tables. "Mr. Wade, Mr. Patterson, do either of you object to hearing this testimony?" Wade was clearly conflicted. Objecting too strenuously might make it appear that the prosecution was afraid of what the boy might say, but allowing potentially damaging testimony could undermine his case entirely. "Your Honor, I maintain that this witness is not credible due to his obvious bias, but the prosecution does not object to hearing what he has to say." "Very well. Mr. Murphy, please approach the witness stand." Daniel walked down the center aisle of the courtroom on unsteady legs, acutely aware of every eye following his progress. He had never been the center of so much attention in his life, and the weight of what he was about to do pressed down on him like a physical burden. After being sworn in and taking his seat in the witness chair, Daniel opened his leather journal to a page marked with a piece of string. His handwriting was careful and precise, evidence of the education that Marcus Cole had provided during their months together. "Mr. Murphy," Defense Attorney Patterson began gently, "please tell the court what you observed on the evening of Theodore Blackwood's death." Daniel took a deep breath and began reading from his journal. "Tuesday evening, October 15th. I was sleeping in the alley behind Peterson's general store when loud voices woke me up around 9 o'clock. I looked towards Silverdale Creek and saw 2 men standing under the big oak tree, arguing about something. Could you identify these 2 men? One of them was Mr. Theodore Blackwood. I recognized him because he came to town every week to do business. The other man was younger and looked similar to Theodore. He called Theodore brother during their argument. Vernon Blackwood shifted uncomfortably in his seat, drawing worried glances from several people sitting near him. What were they arguing about? Patterson continued. Daniel consulted his journal again. The younger man, Vernon, was asking Theodore for money. He said he owed gambling debts to some dangerous men and needed $5,000 to pay them off. Theodore refused and said Vernon had already wasted too much of the family money. What happened next? Vernon got very angry and started threatening Theodore. He said something like, "If you don't help me, I'll be dead within a week, and then you'll inherit all my debts anyway." Theodore told him that maybe it was time Vernon learned to face the consequences of his actions. The courtroom was completely silent now, hanging on every word of Daniel's testimony. Even Judge Fitzgerald leaned forward with obvious interest, clearly recognizing the significance of what the boy was revealing. "Did you see what happened next, Mr. Murphy?" "Yes, sir." Vernon pulled out a pistol and pointed it at Theodore. Theodore tried to calm him down, saying they could work something out, but Vernon was too scared and angry to listen. He shot Theodore 3 times in the chest. Gasps echoed throughout the courtroom, and Vernon Blackwood jumped to his feet. "That's a lie! This boy is making up stories to save his friend." Judge Fitzgerald pounded his gavel sharply. "Mr. Blackwood, you will remain seated and quiet, or I will have you removed from this courtroom." Daniel continued reading from his journal, his voice growing more confident as he progressed. After Vernon shot Theodore, he dragged the body closer to the creek. Then he went to Theodore's horse and took a rifle from the saddle scabbard. "I recognized it as the kind of rifle Mr. Cole uses for hunting." "How could you recognize Mr. Cole's rifle specifically?" "Because Vernon threw it on the ground near Theodore's body and said, 'That should take care of the blacksmith.' I realized then that Vernon had stolen Mr. Cole's rifle to make it look like he was the killer." Prosecutor Wade objected strenuously. "Your Honor, this testimony is clearly fabricated. How could this boy have heard specific words spoken from such a distance?" Daniel looked directly at the prosecutor. "Because I wasn't that far away, sir. The alley behind Peterson's store is only about 30 yards from that oak tree, and it was a quiet night. Sound carries real well across open ground when there's no wind." Judge Fitzgerald nodded thoughtfully. "Continue with your testimony, Mr. Murphy." Vernon searched through Theodore's pockets and took his money and pocket watch. Then he mounted Theodore's horse and rode toward town. "I waited about 10 minutes to make sure he was gone before I went to check on Theodore, but he was already dead." "Why didn't you report what you had seen to the sheriff immediately?" Daniel's voice dropped to almost a whisper. "Because I was scared, sir. I'm just a homeless orphan, and Vernon Blackwood is a rich, important man. I didn't think anyone would believe me, and I was afraid of what might happen to me if I accused him." "What changed your mind?" "When they arrested Mr. Cole, I knew I had to speak up. He's the only person in this town who ever treated me like I mattered. He gave me food when I was hungry, taught me to read and write, and never asked for anything in return, except that I tried to be honest and do the right thing." Daniel closed his journal and looked directly at Judge Fitzgerald. "Your Honor, I know I'm just a kid, and I know people don't usually listen to what kids have to say, but I wrote down everything exactly as it happened, and I swear on my parents' graves that every word is true." The impact of Daniel's testimony was immediate and profound. Several jury members were whispering among themselves, and the entire atmosphere of the courtroom had shifted dramatically. Vernon Blackwood sat rigid in his seat, his face a mask of barely controlled panic. The truth is finally coming out, but will Daniel's brave testimony be enough to save Marcus? Subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell to see the shocking conclusion of this courtroom drama. Prosecutor Benjamin Wade rose slowly from his chair, his face a carefully composed mask that couldn't quite hide his growing concern about the direction this trial had taken. He had built what seemed like an ironclad case against Marcus Cole, but the orphan boy's testimony had introduced elements that threatened to unravel everything he had worked to establish. "Mr. Murphy," Wade began, his voice taking on the condescending tone he typically reserved for witnesses he considered unreliable, "you testified that you've been living on the streets for 3 years. Is it fair to say that during this time you've had to, shall we say, be creative about obtaining food and shelter?" Daniel met the prosecutor's gaze steadily. "If you're asking whether I've ever stolen anything, sir, the answer is yes. I've taken food when I was starving and slept in places where I wasn't supposed to be. But I've never lied in a court of law. But you have lied before, haven't you? To storekeepers, to sheriff's deputies, to anyone who might cause problems for your lifestyle." "I've told lies to protect myself from people who wanted to hurt me," Daniel admitted. "But this isn't about protecting myself. This is about telling the truth to save an innocent man." Wade began pacing in front of the witness stand, clearly hoping to intimidate the young boy. "You claim to have perfect recall of a conversation that took place in darkness from 30 yards away. Don't you think that's rather convenient?" Daniel opened his journal again. "I wrote down everything I remembered as soon as I got back to my hiding place, sir. I didn't wait until morning, because Mr. Cole taught me that memories get fuzzy if you don't write them down right away." "How do we know you didn't just make up this story and write it down recently?" "Because I can show you other entries from before and after that night, sir. My journal has weather observations, notes about people I saw around town, even some poems I tried to write. Everything is dated, and you can see that the handwriting and ink are consistent." Judge Fitzgerald intervened. "Mr. Wade, I'd like to examine that journal myself." Daniel handed over his precious book, watching nervously as the judge flipped through its pages. The journal contained months of observations written in Daniel's careful hand, creating a detailed record of daily life in Silverdale from the perspective of a homeless child. "This appears to be genuine," Judge Fitzgerald observed. "The entries are consistent in handwriting and ink, and they contain the kind of mundane daily observations that would be difficult to fabricate convincingly." Wade was clearly frustrated by this development, but he pressed on with his cross-examination. "Mr. Murphy, you testified that you saw Vernon Blackwood shoot his brother, but you also testified that you were hiding in an alley. How can the jury be certain that you correctly identified the shooter in the darkness? There was a full moon that night, sir, and I got a good look at both men when they were standing under the oak tree. The moonlight was bright enough that I could see their faces clearly. You claim that Vernon Blackwood said that should take care of the blacksmith after placing Mr. Cole's rifle at the scene. Don't you think it's suspicious that the killer would make such an incriminating statement aloud?" Daniel considered the question seriously. "Not really, sir. Vernon was talking to himself, probably trying to work through his plans step by step. People do that when they're nervous or scared." Wade realized that his attempts to discredit Daniel were actually making the boy appear more credible and thoughtful. The orphan's honesty about his own past misdeeds and his careful consideration of each question were having exactly the opposite effect of what the prosecutor intended. "No further questions," Wade said tersely, returning to his seat with visible frustration. Defense attorney Patterson rose for redirect examination. "Daniel, I want to ask you about your relationship with Marcus Cole. How long have you known him?" "About 6 months, sir. He found me sleeping in his blacksmith shop one night last winter and gave me food and a warm place to sleep. Did Mr. Cole ever ask you to lie for him or to do anything dishonest?" "No, sir. Just the opposite. He was always telling me that honesty was the most important thing a man could have, especially someone who didn't have money or family to fall back on." "Did he know that you had witnessed the murder when he was arrested?" "No, sir. I was too scared to tell anyone what I had seen until I realized that Mr. Cole was going to be convicted for something he didn't do." Patterson nodded and turned toward the gallery. "I'd like to call Vernon Blackwood to the stand." The courtroom erupted in surprised murmurs as all eyes turned to Vernon, who had gone completely pale at the mention of his name. "I don't have to testify against myself," he stammered. "I have rights." Judge Fitzgerald's eyes narrowed as he studied Vernon's panicked reaction. "Mr. Blackwood, you are not currently charged with any crime, so the Fifth Amendment does not apply. However, you are not required to testify as you are not a party to this case." I don't want to testify," Vernon said, his voice barely audible. The judge's expression grew increasingly grave. "Mr. Blackwood, your refusal to testify, while legally permissible, is certainly noteworthy given the serious allegations that have been made against you." Deputy Sheriff Matthews, who had been sitting near the back of the courtroom, quietly rose and began moving toward Vernon's location. The lawman had been observing Vernon's reactions throughout Daniel's testimony, and his professional instincts were clearly aroused. Patterson pressed his advantage. "Your Honor, I would like to point out several inconsistencies between the prosecution's case and the physical evidence. According to Deputy Matthews' testimony, My client's rifle was found 50 yards from the body. But if Mr. Cole had shot Theodore Blackwood from that distance, the powder burns on the rifle barrel would have been much less pronounced. Judge Fitzgerald turned to Deputy Matthews. Is that accurate, Deputy? Matthews nodded reluctantly. Yes, sir. For powder burns that fresh and heavy, the rifle would have had to be fired from much closer range. How much closer? No more than 10 or 15 feet, Your Honor. Daniel raised his hand from the witness stand. That's about how far apart Vernon and Theodore were standing when Vernon shot him. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place with devastating clarity. Vernon Blackwood's guilty behavior, the inconsistencies in the physical evidence, and Daniel's detailed eyewitness account were creating a picture that differed dramatically from the prosecution's original theory of the case. Judge Fitzgerald looked around the courtroom, his expression reflecting the weight of the decision he was about to make. Based on the testimony presented here today, I am compelled to conclude that serious doubts have been raised about Mr. Cole's guilt. The judge's voice grew stronger and more authoritative as he continued. More troubling still, credible evidence has been presented suggesting that another individual may have committed this crime and deliberately attempted to frame the defendant. Vernon Blackwood suddenly bolted for the door, but Deputy Matthews was ready for him. The two men collided near the back of the courtroom, and Vernon's desperate struggle only served to confirm his guilt in the minds of everyone present. Vernon Blackwood, Judge Fitzgerald announced, you are hereby charged with the murder of Theodore Blackwood and the attempted framing of an innocent man. As the handcuffs clicked around Vernon's wrists, Judge Fitzgerald turned his attention back to the original case. In the matter of the People versus Marcus Cole, I hereby direct the jury to return a verdict of not guilty. The evidence presented today clearly establishes Mr. Cole's innocence. The courtroom erupted in applause as Marcus Cole rose from the defendant's table, tears streaming down his weathered face. Daniel jumped down from the witness stand and ran to embrace the man who had become like a father to him. But Judge Fitzgerald was not finished. He picked up his gavel and held it for several moments, staring at it as if it represented the weight of justice itself. When he spoke again, his voice was filled with emotion that surprised everyone who knew him as a stern, unemotional jurist. Ladies and gentlemen, the judge said, today I have witnessed something that shames me deeply. A 12-year-old orphan boy showed more courage and integrity than most of the adults in this courtroom. While respected citizens were content to see an innocent man hang for a crime he didn't commit, this child risked everything to ensure that justice was served. Judge Fitzgerald's hands trembled slightly as he continued. I have spent 20 years on this bench believing that justice was about following procedures and applying laws. Today, I learned that real justice requires the courage to speak truth to power, regardless of the personal cost. The judge looked directly at Daniel, who was still embracing Marcus Cole. Young man, you have taught this old judge that wisdom and courage are not determined by age or station in life. You have my deepest respect and gratitude. With those words, Judge Fitzgerald gently placed his gavel on the bench rather than pounding it in his usual manner. The gentle placement seemed to symbolize humility in the face of a lesson learned from the most unlikely of teachers. As the courtroom began to empty, townspeople approached Daniel to offer their thanks and apologies for overlooking him for so many years. The boy, who had been invisible to most of Silverdale, had become its most celebrated citizen through his willingness to stand up for truth and justice. Marcus Cole placed his arm around Daniel's shoulders as they left the courthouse together. You saved my life today, Danny boy. But more than that, you showed everyone in this town what real courage looks like. Daniel looked up at his friend and mentor with eyes that seemed older than his 12 years. You taught me that everyone deserves the truth, Mr. Cole, even when the truth is hard to hear. The story of the orphan boy who spoke truth to power became legend in Silverdale, inspiring generations of children to believe that their voices mattered, regardless of their circumstances. And Judge Fitzgerald never again underestimated the wisdom that could come from the most unexpected sources. What an incredible story of courage and justice! A homeless orphan boy saved an innocent man and taught an entire town about true integrity. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell for more amazing tales of courage in the Old West. Share this inspiring story with everyone who believes that truth and justice can triumph over power and prejudice. What moment touched your heart the most? Let us know in the comments.